The God of Israel is not in space. The God of Israel is not in space. The God spoken of in Israel is not in space. Now, when you read the Bible, though, there's certain passages that will make you believe that the God of Israel is in fact somewhere off in space, and that it's going to come from space, it's going to come in a cloud, it's going to come down from heaven. And the heavens are, of course, the space that surrounds the earth and that goes indefinitely into the universe, right? That's space, and that's where people think God is out there somewhere and he's going to come down from space. And so that's actually a false God. It is written into the Bible that this is a description of God, but this is not the God of Israel. The God of Israel is not in space. Now, the reason why there are passages that would lead one to believe that the God of Israel is in space is because the Bible evolved out of paganism. The Bible evolved out of paganism. Our religion of the West and America and Europe evolved out of paganism. The religion of Moses evolved out of paganism. The religion of Abraham evolved out of paganism. And there's a certain series of understandings that would lead you to conclude that God is not actually in space. Even if you started out that way. You started out as a pagan. If you start out as a pagan, eventually you'll realize that there's this other thing which is not in space, which is the God spoken of by Isaiah as the God of Israel. Now, how did this happen? Well, if you read the story of Moses in the Exodus, you will see that the God of Moses is clearly a war God. It's a God of war, it's a God of destruction, it's a God that sends diseases, and it sends destruction to the enemies of Moses and Aaron and the Israelites. It sends diseases and destruction against the Pharaoh and the Egyptians in a conflict, because it is a war God at that time. And you have to understand that because it came out of paganism. Now, if you look in later passages, the God of Israel becomes less of a war God and more of a God of wisdom, as we see in Proverbs, as we see in Isaiah. Less of a war God, more of a God of wisdom. So it's a God that evolved over time, but what's spoken of in the Bible as the God of the Israelites is a real tangible thing which you can understand. It's tangible in the sense that it's understandable. Now, atheists will tell you that it's obviously all lies because there's no man in space, and that was all a lie. And there might be men in space, but there's no space God that's going to come down and rescue you. They're right about that. What they're wrong about is that the God of Israel doesn't exist, and that the things being described as the God of Israel don't exist, because they clearly do exist as one's conscience. And so when we look at the Bible and we start with Moses, we start with Moses because, why do we start with Moses? Why are you starting Moses? Why not with Adam and Abraham and Jacob and all these other people? Why are you starting with Moses? Because they're called the 5 books of Moses. And they were written by somebody who came out of Egypt. And this religion didn't really start until these people came out of Egypt. And so the books that we call the 5 books of Moses, most of them are from earlier pagan sources. And I don't want to go into all that because I've covered that pretty thoroughly. They come from earlier pagan sources, but now there's a new religion with a people who lived in Egypt, but were not Egyptian. They were Aramaic people. Okay, they were Aramaic people living in Egypt. They'd been there for a while, and they were never considered Egyptians because they were racially Aramaeans. So they weren't Egyptians. They were racially Aramaeans. And although they were close to many of the centers of power, dealing with the royal families in Egypt, and they were working in Egypt, and they were part of the Egyptian system of government, they were never considered Egyptians. And so they started to say, well, if we're not Egyptians, we're not going to worship these Egyptian gods. We're going to form our, first they just denied the Egyptian gods because we're not Egyptian, so we're not worshiping the Egyptian gods. And eventually they came up with their own religion, which they pieced together out of their ancient Aramaic culture and the Egyptian religion, which they knew much about because they were immersed in it for so long. So as they come out of Egypt, they form a new religion. Now, this religion really starts as a tribal god. It's a tribal god of these people who are Aramaic. They're racially Aramaic, and they're coming out of Egypt. They've got a tribal god that cares about them and them only. And it's a war god, so it wants them to defeat their enemies in battle. Now, how did that go from being see, that's very pagan. You could say it's one god of many, actually. So it's kind of a monolatry. They say that it's one god, but it's still a pagan religion. They're still sacrificing animals to the god, and they're still doing these pagan rituals to one god instead of different gods. Now, what is that all about? Well, there's different gods for the different seasons. There's different gods for the different depending on where you live. Every town has its own god, right? Every city has its own god, and there's a pantheon of gods. Well, they said this is our god. We're calling it Yahuwah, or we're calling it El later. But so it was a tribal god. It's a god of this tribe. And not all the other Aramaic tribes. It's only the god of this tribe that comes out of Egypt. That's the only tribe that this is the god of, right? Not of any of these other people. Well, I guess that's hard to say because it looks like, let me give you this. So then you go, well, what about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? It appears to me that those were written in after, suggesting that this had been a much older religion than it was. You see, in other words, Moses, the book of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, he's writing in this new God, he's writing in the story of their people, and they're making it to where they've always worshipped this God, as they're saying. Which isn't true, but that's the new story, is that it's always been there, right? Now, how did this God come about, and what has this God existed earlier than Moses? That's another question. So, the way that the God came about is that if you're sacrificing animals to a god, you're doing that because you want to appease the god. You want to be on the god's good side, right? So you're saying, I brought you this animal. I'm going to kill it and give it to you, and that way you'll favor me. You want to be favored by this god, which is considered to be, these pagan deities. It's the god of the storm. It's the god of the sun. It's the god of the moon. It's the god of, agriculture. Whatever god it is, it's some deity. It's an idea about a natural phenomena that exists in the universe. So it's out there. It's in the universe out there. But as you begin to go through the Bible, you will find that out of this idea that God favors you or unfavors you, you get this whole system of ethics or morality on what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. So out of paganism, we start to get this system of morality. What's right? What's wrong? What's good? What's bad? This becomes the God of Israel in later stories. This becomes the God of Israel talked about in Proverbs. Why? Because where does all this stuff really come from? It doesn't come from space, and it doesn't come from these natural deities. It comes from one's conscience. Is one doing right? Is one doing wrong? You see? And so this is why the paganism really led to a system of ethics. It led to a system of ethics. The sacrificing of animals, and I want to be favored by these gods, or this god or that god, led to a system of what is right and what is wrong behavior. So now we get into this whole system of behavior and doing right and doing wrong. Well, doing right and doing wrong according to what? Ultimately, it's doing right or doing wrong according to one's conscience. And this is why all of the metaphors and allegories and symbolisms of the Bible really are true when they apply to one's conscience, right? Because if you transgress against your conscience and you do something wrong, you feel bad. You make yourself miserable. Right, you have this recollection, this memory of you doing something, and you're disgusted by your behavior, right? So then you're in hell. You're not literally in the grave. That's a whole other story. Originally, the idea of hell is a Greek word for Sheol, which means the grave. So you die and you go to hell. So now in the Old Testament, this idea of going to hell, or they didn't really talk about it in the Old Testament. The idea in the Old Testament was mainly from the time of Moses, was about the group surviving as a group and was going to survive as a group or was going to be killed off. And it was the purest people among the group that followed the law perfectly. They were the ones that were going to survive, right? So these are ideas of laws coming from a space god. But really, these laws come from your conscience. So it's more like the divine law isn't coming from space, as it's depicted in many areas in the Bible. But the divine law is, as it suggests in Christianity in some passages, written on the heart. It's written on the souls of men, is this divine law. That's the conscience. That's actually the supreme divine law, which is above any other law that you could possibly come up with, because it's the law. In other words, this is the difference between the Gnostic God and the exotic God, the God in space, the God that comes from space versus the God that dwells within you, which is the divine law, which exists within you, and you know right from wrong. And so which one's the real God? Is it the space God? Is it the God that you should sacrifice animals to? Or is it the inner wisdom that's written on your conscience, which is divine law? And it really is divine law because it's something that comes from eternity. It comes from the infinite. It comes from another dimension which is not of this universe. So that's where it all comes together, where you realize that you as a human being and as a human soul are part of this divine system. And that's what you're part of. So when you transgress against it, which is really what the media and the TV and all these different systems in the government, they're like, we have a government today, I can't talk about the government. Never mind, this is YouTube. I can't talk about any of that kind of stuff on YouTube, and so I won't, because I don't want to lose my YouTube channel. So, but you have a lot of things in society which are going against what is right. And they want you to be wrong. They want you to commit crimes. They want you to be a deviant. They want you to be a criminal. They want you to be a pervert. They want you to be disgusting. They want you to be a horrifying pile of trash because they want you to die. And the Bible covers that pretty clearly, that, like if you get that passage that says, straight is the gate, which means how you walk, and that leads to life, and wide is the road that leads to death. There's lots of ways for you to die. There's lots of ways for you to destroy your life. But there's a very narrow path that leads to living. Now, when some people, the Christians, will think, well, that's talking about there's a narrow path to Jesus. And they think Jesus is like someone who came from space. He came from the space god, then he incarnated as a man, and then he was sacrificed on the Passover, and then he rose from the dead. And that's a story, and I don't believe that's a true story. I think it's a fictional account, but I think there's some basic ideas in there. I don't know. I'm just saying it follows. If you read the New Testament Gospels, forget about the writings of Paul, which I do, even though some of them are okay. Most of the teachings of Jesus are restatements, him restating something that was said in Isaiah, or restating something that was said in Deuteronomy, or restating something that was said in an earlier book. And so a lot of the passages of the Gospels and Jesus' words are him restating something that was from an earlier passage. And a lot of the Bibles don't do that. They should go through passage by passage and tell you where this statement is that Jesus is saying, where you can find it in the Old Testament, because they should do that so that you can compare what he's saying to the Old Testament, and you'll see that it's a restatement of stuff that was in earlier books. But the point is that the whole story of the God of Israel is ultimately what it started out as, a tribal war god of an Aramaic race of people that was living in Egypt. And they came out of Egypt, and according to the story, they had wars with these other Aramaic people that were living in Canaan and in the north, and the Hittites and these other people that were living around. But that's all that so it's about one specific people, right, that came out of Egypt. Now, here's the question, and this is why I'm suggesting that the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph were written later, is because those people did already appear to have this Gnostic style. Not Gnostic as like some crap you'll read on Facebook or something, or see a YouTube video about Gnosticism, which is about sex and symbols and all this gay stuff, or silly stuff. But Gnosticism in terms of an inner knowledge that's the divine law that comes from the Creator about right and wrong. So now, because Abraham walked with God. Did they say Noah walked with God? Okay, well, that means he was a righteous man, right? So he was already a righteous man, and so he was following what? He was following his conscience. And Abraham, was kind of in the same model of Noah, following his conscience and following this God, which is suggested to be somewhere else, right? It's talking to him from space. Or is it really just a metaphor for the conscience? I'm saying it's a metaphor for the conscience, because it can't really be anything else. That is there is no space God. If there's something coming from space with like a spaceship, that's not God, that's an alien, a UFO, right? Now, are there UFOs? Probably. I think there probably are UFOs. I'm not someone who, I think that the universe is infinite. And so there's probably been people come down from UFOs, and there's been wars in space, and I'm sure all that stuff has really happened. But that has nothing to do with the God of Israel. And so sometimes people mix up. Well, here's what happened. Because if you look at the old pagan books, right, the gods were the stars, right, and they were other natural phenomena. So now in the Bible, those are the angels, right? Those other stars are the angels, and you'll see these imagery of God coming down from heaven with the angels. Well, those are all because it changed from paganism into the new God. Now you have the one God and his angels, whereas before it was the God and the other gods, right? They were all gods. Well, now we have monotheism, so we can't call angels gods. We have to call them angels. But originally those were the stars. So now we're seeing the stars are now depicted as angels, and God is often depicted as the sun in the sky. And, we don't have to get into all that, but that's astrotheology, right? So they changed it, they made it into something different. But ultimately, they're trying to change it into something that relates to one's conscience, because the truth of the matter is it's kind of inverted. And people think that the universe is this vast, infinite space which God dwells in. And that's not true. The universe itself, the reason why God is not in space is because space is an illusion. In other words, it's a dimension of the mind. And just like you individually have a mind, you have a memory, which is a three-dimensional image, and you can see the future, which is a three-dimensional image. Because the mind is not the brain, it's a three-dimensional image with space and images in it. Right? It's got people in it, it's got images, it's got spaces, it's got locations. That's the mind. That is the mind. It's not your brain. And the mind is created as a physical representation or a mechanical representation of thought. It's a mechanical or physical or mechanical representation of thought. So you have a thought, and it's represented in the form of this 3D image, which has space and energy in it, has a motion of through space. That's called the mind. So it's an illusion, really, of space and energy, which is a mechanical representation of thought. So every individual has this. You can imagine a future. You can remember the past. Okay? And collectively, you can see a universe. Collectively, you can see a universe. And this is written in the Hermetic science that comes out of Egypt through Greece. The science of the Hermetic schools, which are the secret societies of the high priests of Egypt, said that, and of Greece, said that there is that the universe is mind. that the universe is the mind. It's a collective mind, actually. And they didn't say that. They just said it is mind. But the universe is a collective mind. And you have an individual mind and you have this collective mind. And that's why there's no God in space. Just the same way that when you remember something or you envision something in the future, it's not really there. It's there. You can see it, but it's not the real thing. The real thing is you causing it to appear through thought. So the real thing has always been you. And so the universe is the same way. It's there, you can see it, but it's not the real thing, right? And so the deeper you go into space, there's nothing there. There's nothing. The real thing is where you are, and the illusory thing is around you, is what you're seeing, right? So it holds true for your own mind, and it holds true for the physical universe. So there's not going to be a God out there in space, and that idea that there is a pagan. It's a leftover idea from paganism. It's a leftover idea from these primitive pagan religions, astrotheology. It's just an idea that you can see that paganism was the road to monotheism, which was the road to Gnostic understanding of God, which is that God is the divine law of one's conscience. And that is the key to the infinite. That's the key to immortality. Because where that divine law is where you are, and that's where immortality is. So you are part of this thing called the Creator, the divine Creator. You're part of it. You're part of it. And so, that's really that's where the whole road leads to. That's where it all leads to. So now, because of that divine law, there's this whole system of right and wrong and good and evil and being righteous and being virtuous and being wicked, that all comes from this infinite. This comes from the infinite thing, which you're part of. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's what's being described in the Bible, in Proverbs, in certain passages, in Psalms, in certain passages in the Gospels, in certain passages of Isaiah, and the story of Abraham and the story of Noah, the righteous one. I've said it before. Why was Noah? This is the key to understanding the whole story. Why did they change the story of the flood? Well, because in the ancient pagan story, the gods killed people because they were noisy, and they saved, and some humans were saved because the creator of the humans, named Enki, didn't want them to die because they were his creation. In the story of Genesis, man is destroyed on the earth with a flood because he's wicked. And he's saved because he's righteous. Noah is saved because he's righteous. The other thing I was going to tell you is that the story of Abraham. This is a legend of Abraham. So there is a possibility that this idea that I'm telling you about this Gnostic understanding of the God of righteousness, which is within the conscience, the divine law of the conscience, that this actually did exist in prehistoric times, because you had the legend of Abraham, and in Chaldean he was known as Zoroaster. He was known as Zoroaster in Persia. Did that person exist? I don't know. Were there people like that? I hope so. Which would suggest that this religion is actually older than people would presume, because it would presume that it would mean that for longer than the Bible was written, before the Bible was written, there were already people that understood that there was this divine law within them, that was their connection to the infinite, and that's really what people have been searching for when they're reading these old passages. Is that in the story of Abraham and in the story of Enoch and in the story of Noah, did this religion exist before? Did we have this understanding before that the divine law of the conscience was our connection to the infinite? Because this is the purest religion that there is. There is no pure understanding of God than this. This is the purest understanding of God. The God in space is not pure. The God being sacrificed by the Pharisees and the Romans, that's not as pure as the infinite God who connects with us through our conscience. And so we hope that this religion has been around a long time. And it should be, because if we're eternal and the human soul is eternal, then it would have been around since the beginning of time. So that would be true. Anyway, so that's the message for today, and have a good one. Have a good one.